Welcome to Redirect Immigration Law and Perspectives, a weekly dive into the world of immigration law and its human consequences. I'm your host, Stephen Robbins, joined shortly by co-host and fellow immigration attorney Matthew Archambault. This week, we are joined by Sophia Gurule. She's an attorney at the Bronx Defenders, and she helps primarily detained immigrants navigate our wonderful immigration system. And in fact, that's what we're going to talk about today. Last week, we talked about restructuring the immigration courts, taking them out of the Department of Justice and turning them into independent courts. And I think that in some ways, it's a good idea. There's some benefits to be gained from doing that. On the other hand, in a lot of ways, I also understand why somebody like Sophia would say that it's a lateral move and it's going to take a lot of political force and effort to get something like that done that doesn't really structurally change the way that we view immigration or immigrants, people of color. And so when we put so much thought and effort into just sort of changing the shape of the thing, we might actually fail in making real progress. And so something that we get to at the end, which I think is really important, so often when we talk about immigration reform or some of these things, there's a trade-off. You're not going to get everything that you want all at once. But sometimes the types of reform that we talk about or that are proposed by politicians involve some small number of benefits, limited number of green cards or work permits, and then a bunch of draconian things on the back end. And it's always tempting to want to take those benefits. Something is better than nothing, we're sort of made to believe. But what if in the end, the system is actually structured in a way that is worse? And that's what we have to be, I think, really, really careful of. And we need to be thinking about what is the world that we imagine and how do we take steps to getting closer to that world? How can we make sure that we're not just rearranging the deck chairs of the Titanic, so to speak? I don't know if that's the right metaphor. Maybe I'm not making any sense, but I think it's a good conversation. Many people will agree with Sophia. Many people will not agree with Sophia. But I do think it's a really, really good conversation, and it is challenging the way that even I see things and some of the assumptions that I've brought to the table that I carry with me, even though I've been practicing for 10 years. And I think that's a good thing to challenge ourselves. I did want to mention briefly, there was this announcement today that the administration is going to implement what they call a rocket docket for asylum seekers who recently arrived at the southern border. And basically, it's an effort to take resources, immigration judges, and try and put those people through first. And what that means is if you've been here a long time, it could be that your hearing gets continued another 2 or 3 years because the judges are being maybe shipped down to the border, or the resources are going towards trying to expedite those cases. And this is not something that's new. It's something that has been tried before. It never really works at achieving, I don't think, even the stated goal, right? And I disagree with the stated goal, but even on its own terms, I think that the project sort of fails. And it especially fails when you realize that the administration hasn't done anything to reverse the harm, anything that was done by the Jeff Sessions Attorney General term or his time as AG, or anything that was done during the Trump administration, right? The decisions issued by the attorney generals, all the different changes to the asylum process and qualifications and all these sorts of things, none of it has been changed. And so to just take the system and to say, well, we're going to rush these people through, you got to get rid of the meat grinder before you run these people through it. And it's really kind of shocking, to me at least, to find myself here in May. Here it is May, it's almost June. And to have no real changes in the immigration court, And then for them to come out with this, it shows that they're open to changes, they're open to restructuring things or moving things around, but only in a way that negatively impacts immigrants, in a way that is designed to expedite and increase the number of removals, essentially, the number of people they can remove in a short period of time. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But, I have a hearing next week. It's my first June hearing. And I remember after the election talking to this client and saying, obviously the future is uncertain, but Joe Biden won. And it seems like a foregone conclusion that by the time your hearing comes around in June, which seemed forever, right? That's forever. Something will be different. Either prosecutorial discretion memos or adjustments to some of these really terrible asylum decisions that control these types of cases. And honestly, it's really upsetting to have made it all the way to June and we get our first big announcement. And what is it? It's the implementation of this so-called rocket docket. So I know it's always such an uplifting show, but I will say the conversation with Sophia is really great. And I hope that if some of this stuff seems, sort of out there or very radical, that you at least spend the weekend thinking about it, right? And challenging the assumptions that you have about deportation, about immigrants and criminal justice, all these things. I think it's important to revisit them. So enjoy the conversation. If you like the show, subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, patreon.com/redirect. You can become a patron and support the show. We appreciate all our patrons, and we'll see you next week.
Today, we are joined by Sophia Gurule. Is that right?
Yeah, it's cool.
Just tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're wrong. It's fine, though.
What?
You're wrong. It's Sophia Gurule.
Okay.
Or Gurule, depending on how hard you want to go.
So you weren't even on the spectrum of...
I got Sophia right. So there we go. Sophia is joining us today because we want to talk about abolition.
Well, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell our listeners about who you are and what you do.
Sure. I am a public defender based in the Bronx. I am part of public defender program for detained immigrants facing deportation. And I also do policy work as well around immigration policy and law. And I am an organizer and an abolitionist. I don't think borders, prisons, jails, surveillance, or any of those things should exist, or at least we should be working to end them.
I mean, if you're a public defender, you must be really bored because Biden was elected. I don't know if you saw that in the news, but
he was a public defender, right? That's what I heard.
He's super open border and he's fixed things. So
yeah,
like, what are you doing with all your free time?
Yeah, exactly. Everything's fine. Everything worked out exactly. The resistance is over and we don't need to be stressed anymore.
Yes, obviously there's a high deal of sarcasm going on here. Now, we often have guests on, and a lot of the talk within the immigration rights community speaks about incrementalism. We can't get everything at once, so we have to accept these small changes. And I myself, in the past, may have accepted that kind of paradigm, but I no longer really accept that paradigm. So how do you view things? Because we'll put them into ALA camp, those who want to work within the system, make these incremental changes, because I guess they're saying they're being realistic, as opposed to maybe your view on how we should go about doing things.
Well, being an abolitionist or someone who believes in abolishing these systems doesn't mean that people are like, oh, this is going to happen tomorrow, or it's like something in the far distance that we're eventually going to achieve. It's basically an everyday analysis and practice in terms of how you think of these different types of problems of carcerality. So for me, it's not so much about incrementalism because everything kind of happens incrementally. It's a matter of like, what does that even mean to you? What are the things that you're actually trying to change? And what are the things that you're actually trying to chip away at. And so what I'm hearing when you talk about incrementalism from organizations or people like those who associate with AILA, they're thinking of it in terms of the immigration courts, independent immigration courts. They're thinking about it in terms of universal representation, which are all things that should be discussed. But then when you talk about actually supporting campaigns or efforts to, for example, end ICE detention, that becomes like a whole different conversation about what it actually means. So for me, being an abolitionist is like thinking critically about the things that we're fighting for. And there's a lot of people who don't think critically, in my opinion, about the things that we're fighting for.
Seems like there's really two conversations going on. One is what is pragmatic, what can be done, where is public support, how do we push public support, and those sorts of things. And the other one is an ideological conversation about what is right and what is wrong. So I'm sure leading up to the Civil War, I'm not a historian, but there were pragmatic discussions about we've got to treat the slaves better because abolition is a total pipe dream. And so, but that doesn't mean that the conversation about the morality of slavery was one that shouldn't be had, right? And it seems like in immigration, conversations about abolition or these sorts of things get shut down so quickly based on these sort of pragmatic arguments.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I always tell people to think about the fight to abolish slavery and what it took and how many different actors and how many different actors had different ideological positions. And I think everyone can fight for the ending of ICE detention or even of ICE in general or law enforcement about immigration status in general. But again, for me, I'm like, what are you actually fighting for? Like, what is the thing that's actually motivating you to go into these meetings with the Biden administration or to even talk about independent immigration courts? For me, what is obvious is that there's a lot of people who think deportations are a thing that are good and should exist and that we need to keep fighting for that. But again, it's like, why are you trying to make fancier, better deportation courts? Like, why is that? Not to keep making it about the courts, but I think the courts is a relevant one and also something that people are talking about all the time. And to me, I'm like, why would you want to fight for deportation courts that we all know are kind of bogged down by xenophobic, racist, anti-Black laws that have always existed, continue to get worse? And if you know anything about independent courts, why do people want to make like criminal courts, basically? We know that the criminal court system is plagued by the same anti-Blackness, racism, classism, transphobia, homophobia, etc. And why do we think that that's going to be the resolution for our problems? And why aren't you willing to think about actually shrinking these systems instead of constantly expanding them? And for me, it's because they ultimately think that deportations are a public good.
Well, let's get right to that, because I think you're right that people are kind of accepting the premise that deportations are legitimate in the first place. Or what are your views on, is deportation in any circumstance legitimate?
No. I mean, for me, why would it be legitimate? Like, why do we think that? And this is when people start rolling their eyes, and I know it, but it's something that needs to be talked about constantly. It's like, how can you actually think that we are more entitled to this land when we ourselves are like settler colonizers who basically are living on stolen land? The amount of times I've gone into immigration court and I look at an immigration judge and I'm like, wow, it's such a joke that you're the person that's deciding that you think you have any right to determine who can be here and who can't. You yourself are not an immigrant, because sometimes judges are immigrants themselves, or you yourself are not someone who came from an immigrant family and or just like a colonizer family straight up. Like, how can you actually take seriously that you belong here more than anyone else? To me, it's only rooted again in like anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous philosophies, and I just don't abide by that. And then it also buys into the premise that immigrants are criminal or illegal, and it's like, what is your justification for that? Like, what is really like motivating you when you think those things?
Well, I think it really hit me not long ago. I was doing a cancellation of removal hearing for a fellow who's been here for over 20 years. He had a family, 3 really good kids. He just opened up a business. They just bought a house. He's a good guy. He actually lives in my community. His kids go to school where my kids go to school. And so we were going over the testimony, what we're going to do. And at the end, I had asked him, this is in preparation. I'm like, is there anything like you want to talk about that I missed? And he's like, well, I just want to apologize to the judge for coming here illegally and all this stuff. And I'm just thinking about it. And I told him, you don't need to apologize. Don't apologize. I mean, if you really want to, that's in your heart. I'm not going to keep you from it. But the system, in some regards, in the best case scenarios where people actually have relief, they're almost expected to beg and to apologize. He's apologizing for coming here and raising a good family. I'm like, why would you apologize for that? He didn't apologize. The case is going to get granted. But the whole thing is, even your best cases, the judge wants to hear that they're sorry for whatever transgression that they did. And even when you take the most heinous crime that you can think of, and of course, anytime you talk about this, people are going to talk about, what about that guy who raped 18 babies and, then ate them and whatever it is, you just have to ask them, if that person had been born here in the United States, what would happen to them, right?
Yeah, it's just
why is that place of birth ultimately the deciding factor in these cases?
I mean, Secretary Mayorkas has said that basically publicly. He's relied on a worst case scenario to justify this kind of constant perpetual punishment. Again, it goes back to the idea of, if you buy the premise, which to be clear, I don't, that the criminal legal system is about rehabilitation, if it's about justice, if it's about fairness, why would you think that someone who complies with all of those things, including, for example, people who served their prison sentences for a felony murder or something like that, why would you then be like, no, you know what, we're going to immediately put this person into ICE detention and deportation because they don't deserve to be here? I know it sounds rudimentary and kind of basic, but for me, I think it's important to constantly challenge people's underlying belief system, because when you really get into it, it's just, again, anti-Blackness and racism motivating all of their beliefs around deportation. I mean, even when I think about the cases that we fight in court, I always say that there's kind of two types of cases, broadly speaking, and there's obviously overlap, but there's the cases where you have to reveal all of your underlying traumas. You have to put it on display for the immigration court. You have to hope that they take mercy on you. And then there's the cases that are basically like, are you deserving enough to be here? Do you deserve to be here? Would your family suffer so much if you were to be deported that you would all be killed? And it's why are we forcing people to basically share their deepest traumas to justify them even being here? Why is that the basis of our entire immigration system? We fundamentally don't need to even do it that way. And we know that there's classes of people who don't experience immigration in that same context. Sorry, that was kind of a tangent, but I was just thinking about what you were saying in terms of this case that you were explaining. And they do expect our clients to basically be apoplectic that they did something wrong. And it's why?
I share the same skepticism that you do of the criminal justice system, but I've seen cases where it has seemed to work. I have a client right now who's detained, who served a lengthy prison sentence, and he went through a sort of get out of gangs program that is actually pretty good. He got a lot of certificates. He really had a chance to learn and grow. And I saw how this person had learned from his mistakes. And it's wow, this is sort of like an idealized version of what is supposed to happen. The system worked. He was in a really bad place, and now he's not. And then he gets handed over to the immigration system, and it's as if none of that mattered. Mm-hmm. None of it. He's back to being the guy who was arrested 3 or 4 years ago for the thing that he feels bad about, that he regrets having done. It doesn't even matter that the system does work sometimes. When it does work, it's totally irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference. You're still just a criminal. You're still just terrible for being here. It's farcical. And, yes, there are serious crimes committed by immigrants, but we've seen it where people get dragged over the coals in immigration court because they had one extra dependent 4 years ago on a tax return because the lady at Taxes y Más told them that they could do it, and they don't know tax law, so they put their nephew on their tax return. And suddenly they're being threatened with deportation. This has actually happened to me. So they're also supposed to grovel about those kinds of things, or an unpaid ticket 10 years ago. It really doesn't matter. Even if they have nothing at all, just the fact that they're here can be enough to criminalize them.
Right. I mean, for me, when I've started thinking about it as just a form of social control and a form of creating subclasses of laborers and workers that will never have the full access to the same rights that US citizens would have. Once that paradigm shift happened in my mind, which to be honest, I would say wasn't that long ago. But when I started thinking about it that way, I'm like, oh, that's just what it is. It's not about anything else. It's not about justice. It's not about belonging to the United States and being a good community member. It's not about redemption or rehabilitation. It's literally just about social control of Black and Indigenous people.
Don't you think one of the challenges is that the reality is, in terms of like what can touch people, or what affects us emotionally, in those terms, deportations do exist on a spectrum. So even the story that Matthew was telling earlier, he did the immigration lawyer thing, which we all do, where you immediately start listing the equities, right? Mm-hmm. Family, business owner, good kids, all of these things. And that's because I think intuitively we understand that there are those cases. And then there's the guy who filled out and applied for a tourist visa 3 months ago, lied to the government, came here, and then started committing certain crimes in a community, right? And both of those things exist. And I think about my sister all the time, who listens to this show, and she's not at all involved in immigration. I think it's a heavy lift for somebody like that to think of those things as being the same, right? Which is why we're always trying to draw the line somewhere. And that's what cancellation of removal is, for example. It's a line drawing. Okay, once you've been here long enough, and once you've, tick all the boxes, you can stay. And how do you convince someone that there should be no line, that they really are all the same?
I think for me, it's about constantly centering the humanity of the people that we work with. And one thing that I think about is that, there's certain deportation cases that are similar, and similar PSGs or similar cancellation cases, whatever. But every case is totally individual when you really think about it. It has so many different factors that are constantly at play because people have different lived experiences. So for me, it's not a line drawing exercise. It's relentlessly and unforgivingly centering people's humanities and centering their stories and centering the fact that, okay, so why did that person lie in the application? What prompted them to come to the United States? What did they actually need and were not given? And how are we as people from the United States also responsible for that? I mean, one thing that I see a lot, particularly working in the Bronx, is I work with people who have had a lot of contact with the criminal legal system. And I've had to make choices in cases where we leaned into that. Obviously, we talk about the positive equities because, of course, that's what we're going to do. But also did a lot of work to contextualize this person is living in a community that is policed in a way that just does not exist for the rest of us. So, of course, this person's going to have X amount of arrests. And of course, this person's going to have these certain final dispositions. And maybe they did take that phone, but really, are we going to prioritize a phone being taken for about 5 minutes? I'm getting very specific, but are we going to prioritize something like that over this person's physical liberty and their ability to stay with their family, all of who are in the United States? So for me, it's just constantly doing that and constantly reminding people of the larger forces at play. But that takes a lot of work, and people don't like to do that necessarily.
So I have had this kind of internal struggle for a little while now, because I've just kind of come to the conclusion that the entire, as you call them, deportation courts, and you're more correct, because that's what they're designed to do. They're not designed to have people immigrate here. That whole system is illegitimate, that it's based in bigotry. It's based in all these things that you've been saying. And sometimes I struggle with, am I contributing to it just by working within it?
By getting all your clients deported?
Yeah. I think I'm a good lawyer. I think I'm a good advocate for my clients. I think generally speaking, they're better off having me than having someone like Stephen or going by themselves. But, is playing the game legitimizing the game?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that it is. We just are. We're giving this image that there's due process happening, which, to be honest, I don't know exactly what y'all do. If you do more detained work, if you do more like non-detained work, I don't know the background. But for me, I am part of the first universal representation program in the United States. And like, it should be a model across the whole country. And like, yeah, we do a lot of amazing work and have a huge impact in some people's lives. But no, I mean, think about all of the things that happen. I have to go, for example, if I'm doing a detained case, they're appearing by video from the jail. I'm appearing by video from my apartment, and the judge is in the Barrack Street Immigration Court. I know that my client is going to have literally no idea what happened in their hearing that day. And then I have to go back and then do a phone call where the video system's probably going to break down, or there's going to be some sort of lockdown or whatever, and then explain to them what happened. And that's all like constitutional. Everyone's like, yeah, this is a totally normal thing to happen. I mean, and that's just like one small example, not even getting into the case law and the way that the regulations are interpreted and the way that the prosecutors basically work with the judges all the time, which is something we all basically know to be true. But for me, doing that work, which I've only done for about 4 years at this point, made me even more radicalized because I was like, this is a joke. These are basically jokes of proceedings. And me being here, yes, once in a while can have a miraculous thing happen, but that is not the norm. And also, who wants to do this work? Why would people want to do detained removal defense all across the country when the courts are so skewed against the people that we represent?
Right. I will say, as attorneys, we don't very often get to observe the pro se docket. But recently I was listening to because I had to get some tapes to find out how this lady was deported. And I don't know if you've ever listened to one of these hearings of a group setting, group deportation. I think you guys are both underselling a little bit the value of having a quality advocate in the context of the immigration court, which is a joke, of course. But if you've ever listened to one of these group deportations, it's absurd. There's no way anyone knows what's going on. There's so much pressure, and there's all kinds of room for all sorts of problems. And then once you're deported, like that's it, right? You don't really have a chance to appeal.
I have a case kind of like that right now, where it was a group deportation. The person was like, I literally didn't even know that I was deported. I thought it was just the first court appearance. I thought I was going to be coming back. And then I got an order in the mail. And I'm like, how did that even happen? And how do you even untangle that to do a motion to reopen, which is, we know, pretty complicated legal work that would require, again, like a competent legal counsel, but is also not a guarantee, and you can still be removed because...
I mean, don't get me wrong, we're cogs in the machine.
100%.
I'm not disagreeing, but like, it's a complicated conundrum, I feel like, because if you take us out of the picture, it does get worse, it seems like, right? Objectively.
For sure. It objectively gets worse. But one thing that I'm always shook about is that I work for a program in an office that has a ton of resources at our disposal. And I can loop in all of these different people just for one person. When I think of someone like Ousmane Darboe, for example, and the level of collective work that it took to get that man out of ICE detention and the work that it's still taking right now, we can't be expected to do this level of work all of the time for every case. And to be obviously not all cases are like that, but for a lot of the cases that you're even referring to, yeah, it takes a lot of collective work. And how can a person without an attorney even start to do that? They can't. So of course, an attorney is going to help with that. But then most attorneys don't even have access to all of the resources that they would need to truly, fully fight that person's deportation, which then begs the question of like, why are we putting people into deportation proceedings in the first place? Why are we making it so impossible for them to even fight their cases in the first place? Why do we think more attorneys is going to solve that problem immediately? And why aren't we trying to actually just dismiss thousands of cases and just like scratch all of the? We really don't need to be doing this. And have the power and the authority to do that. But instead they're like, no, let's get more judges. And you're like, what are you not getting right now?
We've talked about independent immigration courts before. Do you think in any way that it would be helpful? Obviously, I think we all agree it doesn't really solve the problem. But do you think it would be helpful at all? Incrementally better step than where we are now?
I mean, I guess for me, like when I hear people talk about it, I'm like, what do you think is going to happen with independent courts? They're like, okay, well, they can't do these like precedential unilateral decisions from the AG. Okay, what else? Like, what else is the benefit? Like, really, like, I'm not even trying to just be a dick. Like, really, like, what are the things that you think will come out of this that will be so great? And have you been to other courts? Like, have you seen how they play out? I can talk about criminal court. I was just in a criminal court hearing like a week ago, and it was not great, Bob. They were on my client, who's 68 years old, basically wanting to remand him in a wheelchair for like a technical probation violation. None of these courts are good. Like, I go to family court, I go to criminal court. Yes, having an attorney is great. You can fight things. There's always things to fight about. But what are you really trying to achieve? For me, I've never heard a compelling answer. Maybe y'all can give me one, but like for me, I've never heard anything that was totally compelling.
Well, I mean, you can go to, for example, the Eastern District of Pennsylvania Federal Court, right? And these are district court judges, highly respected judges, Senate confirmed, and they are independent. I mean, I guess that's kind of what they're talking about. These guys and ladies are independent. But there are some that are so awful that they make the worst immigration judge look like your favorite, Ruth Bader or Sotomayor.
Judge Judy.
Judge Judy, exactly. So maybe it's a different format. Maybe it's a different form. Maybe things go a little better. But my concern is that we fight for independent courts. We get them, and then people kind of throw up their hands and are like, okay, well, we're done here. Everything's fixed. And maybe even throw in like universal representation when there's an underlying rot that is not going to go away.
Right. Yeah. Like, I didn't even think about the federal district courts. But yeah, I mean, has anyone done a habeas in federal district court? And like, at least when I think about the habeases I've been involved in, I'm like, I don't know why people are so stoked on the federal district courts, because they're not that great.
You get some judges that are great and some judges that are terrible. You don't have anyone overseeing them.
Hold on. This is where I need to step in and just let all of our listeners know I love the courts. I love all the immigration judges, ICE counsel. You guys are the coolest. All of these beefs are not my beefs. I have no beefs. I always step in to let everyone know how much I love the judges, especially in Seattle, Judge Evans. I've got a hearing with him next week.
This doesn't apply to you, Judge Evans.
He's the carve out of all of these things that we're saying. So, Matthew, I agree with you that is a concern, because I actually saw in an email blast recently that was one of the things that the Senate was thinking about taking up, like this move for independent immigration courts. And yeah, that's a real concern. If, I'd rather have a crappy TPS or like a deferred action for parents, something that's not even good. Basically, even the crappiest immigration reform is better than just an independent court, right? Moving the thing from here to there. So I would hate to see our energies put into that.
And also like this idea that it's like more viable to do than other things. I'm like, what? Why do you think that? What is your base? And they're like, oh, it's bipartisan. And it's like, why do you think it's bipartisan? What do you think is motivating that? It's like, because they want people to be deported, because they want to put this fake image that due process is happening and we're doing the right thing and everyone's following the right procedures, even though, I mean, I don't want to like totally slam the last interview I heard you all do, but like the idea that because it's bipartisan, it's going to be easier to do, that everyone agrees in due process, everyone wants to ensure that exists, is like childish in my mind. It's like a naive, completely detached from reality of how courts work, of how power dynamics play out in courts, how courts impact poor people and Black people and Indigenous people versus rich or wealthier white people. It just is so detached from reality. And it's also detached from reality to say like it's an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. As someone who does policy work and is in a lot of meetings about these types of things, it actually takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of mobilization and lobbying to get people to get on board. And it takes a lot of energy. And why would I put my time and energy into something like this that isn't actually going to resolve the immediate problems? And I feel like people who focus on the courts are people who don't focus on what the real problem is, which is why do we have over 1 million deportation cases pending? Why do we think that it needs to all be resolved through a court system? Why are you only obsessed with like a system and not humans? I guess is my question.
What killed me, and this is something I learned years ago when I did a case out of Berks, the Family Detention Center. And this was, I think this was actually before Obama. And my client had like a 2-hour credible fear interview where she went over all her trauma, which was immense. And I remember at the end of the interview, the officer basically said, I'm going to pass her for the credible fear and then she'll get to see a judge. And I said, well, why can't you just grant asylum? Right? I mean, what?
Why not? Yeah.
I mean, it's like you did everything. And the reason for our non-lawyers out there is because the law says that they can't. Mm-hmm. Right? But then she had to go to immigration court and tell her trauma all over again. And of course, telling that trauma to an immigration judge means that she had to relive it with me in preparation 2, 3, 4 times just to get there. Just think about having to tell your greatest traumas of your life, sitting in a witness chair in front of some old white male judge in some ridiculous robe.
And a prosecutor who's playing Minesweeper or something, right?
Exactly.
Online shopping at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's how you have to tell your trauma. Instead of just saying, hey, you know what? When they were with that asylum officer, and this asylum officer, as I remember, was wonderful and very caring and empathetic. And the same story got out. It was probably better told before the asylum officer because she felt more comfortable. But why is it? Why can't we look at things at the very least like that and say, why do we need to have them in a court system where people are afraid and nervous? If we're going to have deportations, right? If they're not going to go anywhere, let's relook how we make these determinations, and are they best served in court? Why does someone who's been traumatized have to be cross-examined? Why? It serves no purpose, from my point, and it's actually harmful.
Right. You're not just retelling the story. There's also this pressure that, like, if you said in your written statement that you were beaten and then raped, but in court, you get the order backwards, like suddenly the whole thing gets thrown out. So it's like, I don't think I can really understand the pressure, honestly, of not just retelling the story, but being under this pressure to remember the minutia and the order in which things happened and the dates and things like that, that people are expected to be able to recall while their life is on the line, right?
Right. And then like the judges are the people who decide what is exceptional and extremely unusual hardship, which you're like, what? Like, what is that concept? And I feel like immigration law has a lot of space. I mean, but like it has a lot of space for judges to just do whatever the they want and use their discretion in any way that they want, which obviously means that they're also rife for, again, anti-Blackness and homophobia and transphobia and all of these different things. And then, of course, it's basically impossible to appeal a lot of those discretionary determinations. And the case law is so bad on those types of discretionary determinations. And again, so when I hear people talking about court systems, I'm like, you're not thinking about all of these dynamics. Basically, at this point in my practice, I'm litigating, assuming that my case is going to go to the Second Circuit, which is just a joke. Like, why is that the basis of how we do these things? And that's an unsustainable way to even be running a court system. And what kills me the most about the court people is that they want all these independent courts. But then when you say, okay, well, why can't we abolish the detained docket? Why does anyone need to be facing deportation while in detention? Ending the detained docket would be a huge deal. It would actually improve access to counsel for all different types of reasons, would theoretically deal with a lot of due process issues. I don't hear any of them talking about that. I'm about to be an ass, but like they don't seem to care at all about any of those things. And I'm like, why can't we say that?
You don't understand what they care about.
Mm-hmm.
They care that they're going to lose revenue. And I've heard this from attorneys, well, what about our bottom line? If they're not in detention, they can still hire you. And actually, they probably have more resources to pay you, and it's easier. I mean, detained cases are hard, right? And where you are, you're at least close by, right? I mean,
I had to take like 5 hours to go to a jail the other day. It took my whole fucking day up.
I guess I was thinking of Barrack Street, which is kind of an anomaly of a detention center that it's located in the urban setting.
It's the court. There is no detention center in the court. But yeah, I agree. It's like in Manhattan, which is a lot easier for a lot of people.
But here, like York, where I practice mainly detained cases, it's a 2-hour drive, which is close, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, how far is your detention center?
Yeah, I live in Central Washington, and the Northwest Detention Center is about 3 hours away.
And you're closer than Seattle, right?
No, it's about the same distance.
Okay. But there are people who have to drive 5 hours or longer, right, to detention centers. And if, God forbid, your client is put in Oakdale or something.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and we try to emphasize this a lot, but there is no immigrant in ICE custody that is serving an active criminal sentence. If you're in ICE custody, you're done with your criminal sentence.
Well, sometimes they're actually impeding the criminal process by detaining.
100%. I mean, we see that all the time in a lot of our cases.
Right.
No one cares.
Yeah.
They're like, we don't care about the survivor of violence or of harm or any. No, it all flies out the window real quick.
You're right. And in detention, especially and in the detained doc, because then you get into that conversation of what about the people who have the final orders of removal and everything, whatever. Let's not talk about them in this context of the detained docket, right? People having to go to immigration court. Because if you're in immigration court, you don't have a final order. Well, you might have a final order, but in be withholding only proceedings, but whatever. But there is no really good reason for it. And there's no real good reason why these people can't be free with their families and their communities. And if you're worried about dangerousness of them, well, if they commit a crime, just like a U.S. citizen, you have policing to take care of it, right? I mean, it's always laughable when you get a judge and a prosecutor who are so concerned about this person being dangerous, and that person lives 5 or 6 hours away from them, and they received no bond. They were released on order of recognizance from their criminal custody, or maybe for a minimum bond, for some perceived crime or crime. But these people who don't even live within their community think this person is so dangerous they cannot get a bond. And who's too dangerous not to get a bond? I mean, it should be such a slight sliver, and they shouldn't be an immigrant in ICE custody for sure. That shouldn't even be a thing.
Let me ask one last question. We had Liz Keys on. She was talking about imagining sort of open borders and how we live actually in a society that's mostly open borders within the United States, right? So you drive to California, you fly to Hawaii, whatever. And I was thinking, even within the United States, there is extradition, right? So if I commit a crime in New Jersey with Matthew, I fly back to Washington, I can be detained and extradited. So do you sort of imagine a situation where if somebody commits a crime in Mexico and then they come here, should they be sent back to Mexico to go to court, basically, which happens within the United States, right? So the United States is sometimes given as an example of an open borders situation that could be viable. We could expand that to Mexico and Canada, right? But even though we have open borders within the United States, basically it's a limited situation, right? Just to face criminal charges in another state or another country.
I haven't even thought of that question, which is why I'm like, what? Like whether or not I think extradition should exist between different countries. And if we, as the United States, have a responsibility to extradite people to other countries who've committed crimes.
Yeah, I guess that's the question. I mean, to me, because I was just thinking that seems to be the only context in which it seems completely justifiable. And it exists already.
I guess you're thinking of the extradition as also deportation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just like thinking about it in the context of someone like Assata Shakur, who the United States would love to have brought back and extradited from Cuba to the United States. And for me, I don't care too much about extradition. I don't really think it's necessarily legitimate. I would have to think about it more because that is like my first frame of reference. The thing that I'm constantly thinking about is the difference between open borders and no borders, which is something that I've only recently really started thinking about because of Harsha Walia, because I'm reading her book and I'm reading it really slowly because it's a lot and I read slow. But she makes the argument that open borders is not the same thing as no borders, which to me is an important distinction that I've never fully grappled with and still am, which is like, a lot of the times people say like, well, open borders already exist. We're moving basically like capital and across borders freely all the time. And we're only prohibiting movement of people, primarily poor people and Black and Indigenous people. But what Harsha Walia kind of argues, and I hope she doesn't listen to this because I'm probably going to get it kind of wrong, is that we should be fighting the nation state as a concept and we should be kind of rejecting borders altogether, which is something that I tend to agree with, which I know is all the judges and attorneys are going to be like, what the like, what does that mean? But like, for me, when I think about like even my own family and the Mexican diaspora, we exist across all of these borders and we have, and like, why do we need to have them? And why are people so pressed about keeping them? And when I think at least about the United States, I think that people are pressed to keep them because it would mean reckoning with the fact that this nation was built on the genocide of Indigenous people, the chattel slavery of Black people as a form of forced migration, and honestly, cheapened immigrant labor. To me, those are the three things I constantly think about as the backbones of this country. And I think that's honestly why so many white fascists and Republicans and Democrats are so fixated on immigrants as people to attack, because they actually fundamentally think they're losing their control over this country. And for me, migration is a form of reparations. And part of the reason why I do this work is because I firmly believe in that concept. I firmly believe that actually this land should be returned to Indigenous people and Black people by any means necessary. Sorry, that was a tangent, but that's really not answering your question at all. But yeah.
Well, it was a better answer than question. So
I think that's true, actually.
So I do think it's important to have these conversations because I always feel like the conversation is so far to one side that in what Trump was able to do was to bring up this ridiculous notion of a wall from sea to sea and like mass deportations and all that. Something that people would have looked at as absolutely ridiculous, but now that's where we're at. So the Democrats and even immigration advocates have moved way over to say, okay, well, that's too much, but we don't want to go too far because we're going to look unreasonable. But I think it's really important to have these conversations of abolition, of open borders, of no borders, even to kind of recenter the conversation. And I think there's room for both. I think there's room for people pushing for incrementalism, but I think there's even more importance of people who are pushing a more, I hate to use the word radical because I don't think it's radical, but a more abolitionist, open border type thing, because we need to pull those incrementalists back. I think there's space for both of them, right?
The way that I think about all of the work that I do, at least in the policy context, is I think about it through an abolitionist lens. Is this a reformist reform, aka is this a reform that will only keep the system expanding and sustaining itself, or will this actually shrink the carceral power of this system that we're talking about? Again, for me, it's not about like incrementalism versus abolition. It's about reformist reform. Wow, I'm getting really annoying. It's about reformist reforms and actual like abolitionist organizing and policy making, because there are people who believe in like an abolition democracy. And all that really would mean is shrinking the power of the state to surveil, incarcerate, arrest, deport, detain, whatever, while simultaneously investing in the things that we actually need as a society. And so for me, everything that I do is with that frame of reference. And I just get frustrated because a lot of people don't even have like a political philosophy or a paradigm by which they understand the work that they're doing. They're just doing it because they need to write a book or they're doing it because they're a professor and they're interested in the study, but they're detached from the reality. But
right. And it's such a good point on keeping a broader view of what you're trying to accomplish, because so much immigration reform or comprehensive immigration reform is like, we're going to give 10 people green cards. And now DUI is a CIMT. We're attracted to those 10 green cards on the one hand, but what is the overall reform? Where does that get us in 10 years? It's actually going to be worse. Yeah. And so, that's a really, really important, I think, way of framing the conversation. So
where can people follow you on throughout your Twitter handle?
Let's see if I can do it from the top of my head. At S_PHI. I don't know, to be honest. I can't remember my Twitter handle. You're just gonna have to find it. There's a lot of underscores for a reason. I don't want people to find me, but they have.
Oh, okay. So find her on Twitter. She's a great follow. She's really made me rethink the way I think things. For older practitioners like me, I'm always grateful for the young practitioners coming up who have these, maybe they're not even new ideas, but they're ideas that they're unafraid to come out and to challenge things and paradigms that have just been there and have been getting dusty. So I thank you for that. And so you can find Sophia on Twitter. She's a great follow. And then there are a lot of other people that you'll run into to learn more about what she's talking about.
Yeah. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for saying that. It's very nice.